All right, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thanks so much for joining us for today's informational webinar on fiscal reporting and grants management, which is being hosted and presented for fiscal year 2021 gun violence reduction grantees. My name is Sam Cook, and I serve as a senior project manager within PCCD's executive offices, and I'm joined today by some of my great colleagues from PCCD's Office of Financial Management and Administration on our grants management team, who will be presenting today's webinar and providing some additional supports for you all as you get started with the fiscal reporting process. So I wanted to start with a few housekeeping rules and also some adjustments since as is the norm these days, webinar platforms seem to change week to week. So our Q&A function, unfortunately, is not working today, but we will do our best to try to make sure that we can answer your questions through other mechanisms offline. So we do apologize for that inconvenience. But in any case, wanted to provide some housekeeping rules about the live event platform in general, in case you're newer to it as we are. This webinar will be recorded and is going to be posted on our gun violence reduction webpage as soon as it becomes available, and we'll send a link out to you all once that's ready. We encourage you to please double check your audio settings just to make sure you are able to hear today's presentation using your computer or other device. We cannot hear you using the webinar feature. However, as we mentioned, you will be able to follow up and submit any questions you may have using our email address, which we'll provide at the end. And then PCCD staff, to the extent possible, again, we'll answer as many questions as we can. You can also reach out to your fiscal point of contact on your grant for additional information as well. And then last but not least, a copy of today's PowerPoint slides will also be posted on our website and sent around for future reference. So before I turn things over to our fiscal team for today's presentation, I do want to take a moment just to focus on the goal of today's session. So this webinar was developed specifically for fiscal year 2021 gun violence reduction grantees, recognizing that for many of you, though certainly not all, this is the very first time that you've received funding from PCCD. And so the goal of today's session is really to help familiarize you with PCCD's fiscal reporting and grants management policies, procedures, and best practices. We'll be sharing a lot of important information today. Our goal is to help clarify how these processes work, to help you kind of have a roadmap for how to get started. So if you do have any questions or if you are not clear on anything, again, please don't hesitate to reach out to your fiscal staff member or to another member of our team if you want to talk things through further or if you need further assistance. We are certainly here to help you as you start this journey, or if you've done this before, this will hopefully provide a good refresher on some best practices and things to keep in mind. So moving towards the rest of our agenda, Lynn Fiddler from our grants management team will be taking the lead on presenting today's session, which will include a detailed walkthrough of PCCD's quarterly fiscal reporting procedures. This walkthrough will help you understand how to create a quarterly report in eGrants, the process for entering expenditures, balancing the fiscal report's financial information, as well as the steps for submitting the fiscal report each quarter. Part 2 of Lynn's presentation is going to cover fiscal accountability and the importance of documentation, including specific requirements for PCCD grantees, the types of supporting documentation you'll be asked to keep track of, time and effort reporting for personnel supported through grant funds, as well as other information and best practices. And again, our apologies, we really were hoping to reserve some time for questions and answers, but it would seem that tech has other plans for us today. So like I said, we'll provide some contact information for you all towards the end so that you can get in touch with the requisite folks. So with that roadmap ahead of us, I think we can go ahead and get started. Lynn, would you like to take things away?
Thank you, Samantha. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar today. My name is Lynn Fiddler, and I'm part of PCCD's Grants Management Fiscal staff. And today I'll be covering part of the fiscal walkthrough on how to prepare a quarterly report and then an interim fiscal report and then the supporting documentation requirements that PCCD has for all of our subgrantees. So to get started, Sam, if you would like to forward the slide for me, please. These slides are being presented, and this will give you a detailed walkthrough should you need assistance when you are actually preparing your quarterly reports. This will give you kind of a quick start guide, but by all means, if you ever get stuck along the way, don't ever hesitate to reach out to PCCD staff for assistance. We want your programs to be successful, and we're always here to help. So never hesitate to reach out to us. So the first slide, obviously, showing the table of contents of what you'll see in this walkthrough. So if you're on a particular portion and you need assistance, you can jump through that rather than going through each individual slide, or you can start the presentation from the beginning and do a full walkthrough. Sam, if you move to the sign-on screen, please. Next one, please. The first thing you'll need to do, as you always have to, is log on to eGrants. And when you're doing your fiscal report, the person that you would want to be signing on is the individual in your organization that has the role of the fiscal creator. This will allow the person to complete the quarterly or interim fiscal reports. And if you don't have that individual with those particular roles, they can gain assistance to obtain the proper roles so they can go ahead and complete all the fiscal reports that are required. Sam, if you'd move on, please. So the next thing you'll see is the main menu, and you'll want to click on the top menu link, which reads to access an existing project, a grant application, continuation application, modification, or create, update report such as program report, fiscal report, or inventory report. And that'll be the highlighted link at the very top of the welcome screen. Next slide, please. If you know your grant ID number, you can enter it directly and hit search. Otherwise, on the right hand of the screen, you can go to your awarded projects /active, and that will give you a listing of all of your active grants to select from that you're wanting to complete the quarterly report for. Next slide, Sam. Again, if you are doing a search, all your active grants will show in the bottom part of the screen. It'll have your grant ID, your applicant agency, and then the title of your program. And what you'll want to do is you will want to click on your grant ID number at the bottom of the screen. Next slide, please. And this will bring up your project summary page. If you click on the top menu item, which reads to enter, update, view program, fiscal, or inventory report for this grant, it's a monitoring menu item. If you click on the upper link, that will take you to creating the fiscal report screen. Next one, Sam. So on this screen, you will see you have the option to create a program report, a fiscal report, or create an inventory report. So you will want to select the center icon that says create a fiscal report. And again, if that does not appear for the individual who signed on, you will need to request the proper role so the individual can create the fiscal report. So you'll want a fiscal report creator role assigned. Next, Sam. So now getting into creating the actual fiscal report. Next slide, please. So on the main summary page, you'll hit create the fiscal report. Next one, Sam. Next slide, please. And the first thing you will notice is the dates pre-populate. For a quarterly report, your beginning date will always show the date following the date of any previous reports that were submitted. And then your end date typically will default to the end of that calendar quarter. If it doesn't, or if you're doing an interim report, you can go ahead and change the end date, and you will do that simply by clicking on the calendar icon, and that will populate a drop-down pop-up calendar, and you can change the end date from there. Sam, next one, please. And here's just a preview of what the calendar looks like. At the top of the calendar, you can advance the months, and then you can select the proper date and hit the save button. One thing to note, much like everything in your application, anytime you make a change, hit the save button. Otherwise, it won't recognize the changes and keep them in the system for you. Next icon, please. So now we'll go into entering the expenditures in each budget category. Next slide, please. So you'll notice the fiscal report template will populate what your approved budget shows, and it has two portions to it. Your financial information, which is on the top half of the template, and then the budget categories, which are at the bottom half of the template. One thing to remember all the way through the process, it is important that the top half totals and the bottom half totals mirror one another on when the fiscal report is completed. If those totals do not mirror one another, you'll get an error message and it won't allow you to submit your fiscal report. Next slide, please. The budget column pre-populates. This is what your approved budget is reflecting at the current point in time. The top half indicates where the source is coming from. In this case, it will be state funds. And then the bottom half are your individual budget categories that you have budgeted for your particular grant project. Next category, slide, please. So in the expenses paid this period column is a combination of the user entries and the automatic calculations. So as you're going along, you will be entering information under each link, and then the totals will always pre-populate for you. Sam, next slide, please. In the sample budget we're showing right on the screen right now, you'll be entering expenses under the supplies and operating expense and the consultant categories. So each title is a link that opens up all the individual budget lines under those particular categories. Next slide, please. So here, if you click on the supplies and expense category link, it will open the expenditure detail for that category. Next slide, please. So on the left hand of the screen, it shows all the titles of the individual budget lines. In this case, you have an AC power panel, you have some amplifiers, and some rack mounted kits. And again, all of these are the budget lines you have in your individual approved budget. Under the expenses paid this period column is the budget where you will enter your actual expenditures for the period you were reporting on. And then the budget, approved budgeted amount is shown right next to the supply item titles. Next slide, please. So again, here you'll enter your expenses paid during this reporting quarter. Please keep in mind, if, excuse me, please, if you have an expenditure that you neglected to report in a previous quarter, you can report it in the current quarter, although we do ask that you put a remark in the bottom of the fiscal report, and we'll talk about that section of the fiscal report a little later. But by all means, if you have overlooked reporting an expense in the past, or an invoice didn't come in timely, you can capture that at a later point. So just please keep that in mind. Next slide, please. Your outstanding subgrantee obligations column is for any invoice that you didn't receive, or purchase, or I'm sorry, invoice that hasn't been paid that you have received, or a purchase order or requisition that's been executed during the reporting period, but you haven't paid for yet. So for your expenses paid this period, what we are looking for there are the expenses that you've actually made payment for. Any that are essentially what we would refer to normally as your open payables, that is what would go in your outstanding subgrantee obligation column. Next slide, please. And just like you do the expenses paid this period per each budget line item, that is where you would record your outstanding obligations. And again, this is for any invoices that you received but did not pay during the reporting period, or for any outstanding POs that you may have. Next slide, please. Once you have reported on all the expenses you paid in this reporting period under this specific category, you'll go ahead and again, click the Save button, or you'll have to start all your information over again. Next slide, please. You'll see now, going back to the overall fiscal report template, all of those expenses that you just entered on an individual basis are now being reflected in total under the supplies and operating expense category. Again, the links will feed up into the full category, and that automatically calculates for you. And that goes for your, excuse me, expenses paid this period, and that will give you your total cumulative expenses to date. So if this would be your second quarterly fiscal report you'd be submitting, it would accumulate the totals from your first quarterly report and your second quarterly report, and then also your outstanding subgrantee obligations. Next slide, please. And then the next slide shows the consultant category. And again, you click on the link for the consultant category. Next slide, please. And much as you did for the supplies and operating category, this will open all your details under your consultant category. Again, you'll enter any expenses that were actually paid to consultants in this reporting period, and then any purchase orders or invoices that you received from the consultants that had not been paid would go in the outstanding subgrantee obligation column. Next slide, please. So again, when the reporting is complete, you'll hit your Save button. Next slide. Which will take you back again to your overall quarterly report template. Again, the totals from the consultant category, all the individual expenses will be reflected under your consultant category line for expenses paid this period, your total cumulative expenses, and your outstanding subgrantee obligations column. This is consistent for every budget category throughout the fiscal report. So none of that changes. Next category, next slide, please. And for any budget category that you are over budget, on the extreme right-hand column in the lower portion of your fiscal report template, it will keep a running total and show you if you are over budget and by what percent. Next slide, please. So now we'll get to balancing the fiscal report. If you recall, initially I said the top portion of your fiscal report and the bottom portion of the fiscal report, the totals need to mirror one another. And this is where we get into that balancing act. Sam, next slide, please. So what you'll want to do is review the totals. And Sam, can you go back one slide, please? I think we may have missed one. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Forward, please. So what you'll do is you'll review your columns, and the total funds received to date column will automatically calculate with the exception of any funds that may be required for you to report. And that would be if for some reason you were paid in advance of actually submitting the expenses. Occasionally that will occur, but those are very rare instances, and we take those on an individual basis. Next slide, please. When the grant funds are made available upfront, as I had discussed previously, the unexpended cash column will automatically calculate. Next slide, please. And now we come to the balancing act. What you will do is you will look at your total in the bottom portion for each column for your expenses paid this period. Your total cumulative expenses automatically calculates, and your outstanding subgrantee obligations column. Your expenses paid this period and your outstanding subgrantee obligation totals will need to be reported on your source line. And again, these are state funds, so your expenses paid this period total from your budget categories will need to be entered on your state line in the expenses paid this period column in the top portion of the fiscal report, as is the same with your outstanding subgrantee obligation total column at the bottom gets reported on the state line in the top portion of your fiscal report. Next slide, please. And again, this is showing carrying those totals from your bottom portion and taking it up to the top portion for your outstanding subgrantee obligation column. Excuse me, please. Sam, next slide, please. It appears we're having some technical issues. Here we go. As I had mentioned previously, if you have expenditures that were being paid or reported in this particular reporting period, but actually were attributable to a previous reporting period, we ask that you make a comment in the remarks section, just essentially saying, you know, I neglected to include an invoice from XYZ in this amount in my previous reporting period. I've now captured that in the current report. Something along that line, something very descriptive. The other thing is, if there is anything a little odd, that say you had maybe reported an item on an incorrect budget line last reporting period, and now you made that correction in this reporting period, so your total cumulative expenses are now correct. We would just ask you to make a slight remark in the bottom of this fiscal report in the remarks section, kind of indicating what had occurred. Because again, we're all human and we can all make mistakes, and there is a mechanism that you can correct those, and it just kind of keeps us surprised as to what occurred. So next slide, please. And again, once everything's in balance, you will want to hit the save and continue editing so you can review your entries one more time before you submit. Sam, next slide, please. And then again, just confirm all of your totals are in balance in your source section to the total of your budget column categories. And once you do that, you should be good to submit. Sam, next slide, please. And now we'll go to submitting the fiscal report. Next slide, please. If for some reason you're not ready to submit the fiscal report yet, you can just save it as a draft. And next slide, please. If you're ready to submit and everything is in balance, you can go ahead and hit the submit button. Next slide, please. If the validation error comes up where the source and cumulative expenses and outstanding subgrantee obligations must match report appears, that means you need to go back and just make sure again that the total reported in your source section of the fiscal report mirrors the budget category section totals. And occasionally that will occur, and again, just go back, make sure they mirror one another, and then you should be able to submit your report. Next slide, please. Again, this is just a reiteration of where you can click on if you want to go to an individual portion of the walkthrough for assistance when you're actually filling out your quarterly report, or you can go through the whole presentation again. Next slide, please. And now we'll talk about the fiscal accountability portion a little bit. From time to time, PCCD is monitored or audited by our funders, both federal and state, to ensure we are in compliance with specific parameters attached to each particular funding source that we administer. And part of this monitoring and auditing that PCCD goes through is ensuring that our subgrantees are utilizing the funds as prescribed for each specific funding source. And to help us fulfill this requirement, we monitor or audit our subgrantees. And until we have a history established with a subgrantee, they're monitored or audited on a more frequent basis. Therefore, if you're a new subgrantee of PCCD, you should expect to be monitored fairly frequently. And the way we typically monitor is we request subgrantees submit documentation for the expenses they reported in a particular reporting period. Please keep in mind, you do not have to attach supporting documentation with each fiscal report, only when we request the documentation. And frequently that will come in the form of requesting documentation for one or more specific categories only. And you will receive an email from our monitoring department, and it will outline the period being monitored, the category or categories that are being monitored, and give you a listing of the type of documentation that's being requested. Submission of the documentation actually accomplishes two goals. First, it ensures, if you're a new grantee, that the documentation that you're maintaining on file is in compliance with the accounting system requirements that you agreed to as they were outlined in your grant application budget and as outlined in PCCD's application manual or applicant's manual. If the documentation isn't adequate at that time, PCCD can assist you in ensuring that you do begin to maintain the appropriate documentation. Sometimes what we find is maybe the timesheets aren't quite up to the standards that we have in place, and we will help walk you through as to what modifications need to be made to your time and effort report to get you on track. Or if you don't have your general ledger detailed quite the way it needs to be, but PCD staff, again, is there to assist you, help you become successful, or assist you in the successfulness of your project. So we're always there to help. And then the other purpose that monitoring ensures is that grant funds are being utilized in compliance with your approved grant budget. So again, it's kind of twofold. And you will note when you receive your award letter for this specific grant project, your award letter is going to contain two special conditions. One, outlining the documentation that must be maintained by the subgrantee, and the second, that subgrantees must be familiar and comply with PCCD's accounting system requirements as outlined in our applicant's manual found on page 32. So by signing and submitting the award letter to PCCD, you are agreeing to comply with all of these special conditions. So now we'll talk a little bit about this supporting documentation that we require subgrantees to keep on file and then submit when it is requested. Next slide, please. So the types of supporting documentation that we are looking for are general ledger reports, subsidiary ledgers, time and effort reports, inventory invoices, and reconciliation worksheets. Next slide, please. So with the general ledger, you are required to have specific general ledger accounts for grant fund revenue and expenses that are specific to each grant project you have with PCCD. So in other words, we would expect your general ledger to pretty much mirror at least your budget categories. And then the expenses that are reported on your fiscal report must tie back to the amounts reflected on your general ledger. Now, does that mean that under supplies and operating expenses, where you will have a very detailed budget in your project, your general ledger should try and mirror that as closely as possible. But if your budget detail is extremely specific, you may have a couple budget lines that actually tie back to one general ledger account. But we ask that you keep that to a minimum, so it's much easier to tie each budget line back to your general ledger and make sure that all of that reconciles. And then any subsidiary ledgers that you keep must agree back to your general ledger. Next slide, please. For personnel, there's employee time and effort reports that are required. Next slide, please. Although I don't have an example of the time and effort report included in this PowerPoint presentation, the PowerPoint presentation does include a link back to a sample of a completed timesheet on PCCD's website, and on the website there's also a template that you can utilize. So that will kind of assist you through the process. But time and effort reports are required for all personnel that are funded with PCCD grant dollars, regardless of the funding stream that you're receiving. The following slides will show the minimum standards and recommended best practices for time and effort reports. And PCCD realizes that there are a number of different systems that can be used to satisfy these requirements. And we encourage you to email or reach out to PCCD's grants management team with any questions you have regarding the time and effort reporting requirements. Again, this seems to be one of the areas that subgrantees have the most issues with complying with, but we're always here to help and walk you through the process. Next slide, please. So some of the minimum standards we have for employees that are working on multiple activities or cost objectives is all timesheets must be completed after the fact, and they have to be reporting the actual effort instead of what was budgeted. So if you have an employee that worked 5 hours a day on this specific project, we would expect 5 hours be reported for today for that specific project. And then the employee has to account for all activity which they're compensated for or obligated to their organization for. So if you have an employee who's a 40-hour-a-week employee and their standard workday is 8 hours, each day we have to have them account for their 8 hours. And this can include paid time and unpaid time, so, or leave time. So if you have an employee who had worked 5 hours on a given day, but took 3 hours of paid leave, we would expect to see the 5 hours reported for the projects they worked on or the project they worked on, and then the 3 hours of leave. Time and effort reports have to be prepared at least on a monthly basis, and it has to cover one pay period. And all of these standards are based on the Uniform Administrative Requirement Code principles and audit requirements for federal awards under 2 CFR 200 and the Office of Justice Program Financial Guide. Now, if it's an institution of higher education, they are allowed to follow their own established policies for documenting personnel expenses as provided under the Institute for Higher Education policies, as long as it's in compliance with 2 CFR 200.430. Next slide, please. If you have an employee who is working solely on one activity or cost object, they are not required to complete the full time and effort report as previously discussed and shown in the link to the completed timesheet. They are allowed to do an after the fact certification. And this is only for those employees that work 100% of their time on activities that are eligible for reimbursement under the grant project. The certification only needs to be prepared on a 6-month basis, but it has to be no more than 6-month basis. The certification and the employee timesheet, they both have to be signed by the employee, and they have to be signed by an official who has first-hand knowledge of the work that was performed by the employee. And this applies to full and part-time employees. That goes for the timesheets and the time certifications. And again, both of these are as prescribed under 2 CFR 200. And for institutions of higher education, 2 CFR 200.430. Next slide, please, Slam. So best recommended practices is employees record their time on a daily basis, that each project has a separate code or a name, and that those codes or names are provided to the employees in advance so they know what grant number or project name to log their time for. And again, here is the link for the sample forms, and it shows you a completed time form, and there's also a template that you can follow if you choose to use that for your employees to maintain their time and effort reports on. And then the website also contains a sample of the time certification for those employees who devote 100% of their energies to one specific grant-funded project. Next slide, please. For employee benefits, next slide. What we are looking at again is general ledger accounts for each grant-funded benefit. We would be looking at payroll tax reports for items like FICA tax, for items like health insurance or dental insurance, eye insurance, items along those lines that you pay on a premium basis. We would be looking for the invoices for those particular premiums that are being paid. And then, because benefits can only be funded at a percentage that is equal to or lesser than the percentage the person is personnel funded at, we ask that you provide some type of worksheet that shows all the employees which have benefits charged to the grant, a breakdown of the employee's salary charged to the grant so we can get the percentage of the employee's salary charged, and then a detailed listing of the employee benefits that are charged to the grant and how those benefits are calculated. So in other words, if an employee is funded 50% under personnel for grant funds, 50% of their benefits can be funded by the grant. And we're looking for a worksheet to kind of calculate that out as supporting documentation. Next slide, please. For equipment, supplies, and operating expenses and consultants, the documentation is pretty consistent as to what we're looking for. Next slide, please. So again, much as with personnel and employee benefits, we're looking for a general ledger account for each grant-funded supply and operating expense or equipment line purchase or a consultant. And the backup documentation we're looking for would include vendor invoices. Now, for a consultant that is an individual consultant, that is not connected with a firm, an agency, a company, they have a few additional requirements for their invoices, but overall vendor invoices must include the name of the payee, an invoice date, an invoice number, a description of each product or service that was provided to the subgrantee, a unit price of each of those products or services provided, the total amount of each product or service, and then the total amount of the invoice itself. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, individual consultants have a little extra information that's required for their invoices. Next slide, please. And those additional requirements are kind of in the form of a time and effort report. Now, that is not as detailed as a time and effort report that we require for personnel. Their time and effort report would be if they provided a service to you on a given date, we would expect to see the date, a brief description of the service that was provided on that particular date, the number of hours, the hourly rate, and then the extended total for that date. And then again, the total of the overall invoice, and then all the other information that's included on all the other invoices are also required for the consultants. And again, I always equate this back to if you ever received an invoice from an attorney or a CPA firm, kind of how that's charted out, that is how we need invoices from an individual consultant that are being paid from grant funds. Next slide, please. And now any question and answer. Sam, I'm going to turn it back to you since you have alternative methods for covering the questions and answers, since our technology was not what we assumed it to be today.
There you
Thank
go.
you so much, everyone. And again, if you have any questions anywhere along the line, please don't ever hesitate to reach out to either your program or fiscal contact that's listed on your grant. We're here to help you, and we're always more than happy to assist. Thank you so much.
Oh, of course. Thank you so much, Lynn. I really appreciate you providing that very thorough overview and lots of great information there. As we mentioned before, since our technology is not quite working the way that we expected to, we did want to take a couple of minutes just before we wrap up today's session to cover some common questions that have already been asked by you all through the application and award finalization process already. But before I dive into that, just in case you want to write it down, I do have an email address that you can send your questions to. We will certainly be providing follow-up information to everybody shortly after today's webinar wraps up. So if you don't have a chance to scribble this down, it's okay. It will be coming to you in your inbox shortly. But that email address is our grants management resource account, and it is ra-pccd grants mgmt@pa.gov. And that first part was all one word. So I'll say it again, ra-pccd grants mgmt@pa.gov. So again, if you did have any burning questions, feel free to send those via email. In terms of common questions we've gotten so far, I'm going to start by asking either Lynn or someone else from the fiscal team to maybe talk a little bit about what happens if you submit a fiscal report and realize after the fact that you actually need to change it in some way. Can you revise an existing report after it's submitted without submitting a new report?
Yes. If you contact your fiscal contact person for your fiscal report, provided it has not been approved as of yet, you can go ahead and request it be returned to you, and the fiscal staff will return your fiscal report to you and make the corrections at that point. However, if it's already been processed, we typically ask that you make the corrections on your subsequent report. And at points we've had to have individuals even enter a negative number on a particular budget line. Maybe they reported an expenditure on an incorrect budget line in the previous report. You can correct that by entering it as a negative to remove it from the incorrect line and then placing it on the correct line in a subsequent report. Does that answer your question?
I think so, yeah. The other question that we get is, so let's say, you've been listening to these webinars and you have maybe some new ideas about how your budget should look and you wanted to change something, and you've already gotten your award letter and you're just trying to figure out what some next steps might be for updating the budget or other parts of the grant agreement. Is that possible, or is it more once you get the award letter, you can't make any changes ever? What advice would you have for folks?
We do have a process called a project modification request, and it's actually accomplished through eGrants, much like your application is. There is a link that says create PMR, project modification request, and basically what it does is it pre-populates what your current budget looks like, and then it allows you to edit those lines. Say you have an item that you found out you don't need as many quantity of that you originally anticipated, but you have something else that you hadn't built in your budget that would be very beneficial to your project that you'd like to add to your budget. You have the ability to reduce the amount or zero out the original amount that you had in for an item that you decided you don't need or you don't need as many quantities for, thereby reducing that overall budget amount. And then also you have the ability to add a new budget line for something that you may have discovered once your project was being implemented that, oh, this would be beneficial to the project. You can add that new budget line. Once again, you have to balance out your source if you change it year by year. So make sure your total columns always are in balance. But once you have made all your changes, you would submit the PMR just like you do your application, and then it goes through a review process. Again, if there's any issues, much like your original application, they would be corresponded to you through eGrants in your issues and comments section, just like your application was, and work through that process. And then once everything is tied down and everything is in line with the particular funding source, your PMR would be approved. And once your PMR is approved, then that becomes your new budget template to use as your quarterly report. But until the PMR is approved, your currently approved budget is what is reflected in your quarterly report template.
Thanks, Lynn. Another question we've been getting during our onboarding calls with everybody has been how frequently can you submit fiscal reports? So the standard is quarterly, and they're due 20 days after the end of the calendar quarter, as Lynn shared. But Lynn, do you want to, or Chris, any thoughts on how frequently, maybe more frequently than quarterly, folks could submit these if they wanted to?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. This is Chris. Yeah, you can submit, technically you submit a finance report almost as often as you like. We have a lot of agencies that do take advantage of that and will submit interim reports on a monthly basis. So they will submit an interim report for example, October, November, and then the regular quarterly report after the end of December. That enables us to make reimbursement payments on a more consistent and quicker basis, since we're replenishing the funds that you're spending on these programs more frequently.
Great, thanks, Chris. And I think unless there's any other questions, I'll certainly pause for a minute to see if any folks from the fiscal team want to address anything else that they've heard to date or that typically trips folks up when they're starting on this process. But otherwise, I think we've covered as many questions as we could come up with. Certainly, we invite you again to reach out if there's any questions that we weren't able to get to or anything you want to clarify. But before we wrap up, Lynn, Chris, anything you'd want to add into the mix before we end today's session?
I just like to say first, Sam and Lynn, thank both of you for this excellent webinar. I'd also like to reiterate what Lynn said that please reach out with any questions that you have. We are here to help. We want to see all your programs and initiatives succeed, and we're going to do our best to help you with that. And also all these the documentation that's required and what Lynn went through, where we are trying to make sure that you're following all the guidelines. That should help you, and we hope that helps you in the future be successful in when you apply for other grants from either, again, from PCCD or other grant making agencies. We hope this webinar was helpful, and like I said, and Lynn said, we're here to help and would welcome any questions you have.
All right. Well, on that front, thanks so much, Chris. Thanks so much, Lynn, for masterfully walking us through all of these very complicated, but hopefully not as complicated as you think they are after our walkthrough procedures. You all are an amazing team of fiscal wizards that I get to work with. So I hope this was helpful for everyone in the audience. Again, we'll send out additional information via email a little later today. And I hope everyone has a good rest of the day and a good afternoon. Talk to you guys soon.